so much for inviting me to talk about this wonderful painting by Benjamin West. When I came to Vanderbilt in 1985 and saw the Cowan collection, or the Cowan collection, is that the better way to pronounce it? I was so excited because there are some works down there in American art history that are so important. And so over the years I've been teaching these works and thinking about them. So I'm delighted to have an opportunity to talk about this painting with you, and I thank you for coming. I first want to give you some background about Benjamin West. I don't know how many of you have heard of him as an artist, but he is a Quaker from Philadelphia, and he was self-taught in the colonies. The Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts was not established until 1805. So it's important for us to understand that when Benjamin West decided to become an artist, there were no places for him to professionally study art. They did not exist in the colonies. Between 1746 and 1759, he was an itinerant portrait painter in Philadelphia and New York City, and he was not unique. That is, there are other artists at this time who were traveling from places to places in order to get commissions to do portraits. Between 1759 and 1763, he traveled to Italy to study art through the patronage of two men from Philadelphia, and he was able to do the grand tour. So he went to Italy, he went to France, he went all over. Now again, not only did we not have any place in the colonies in order to study art at this time, but we didn't have any museums. So it wasn't like he could have studied any of this art unless he went to Europe, which is what he decided to do. In 1763, he moved to London, and he stayed there until his death. While in London, he helped establish the Royal Academy of Arts, and that is the academy that was established in London in the 18th century that followed the École des Beaux-Arts that had been established in Paris in the 17th century. And the curriculum that I'm going to be talking about a little more in a moment at the Royal Academy, which still exists in London, is based on that of the École des Beaux-Arts that was established, as I said, in the 17th century. Not only did he do that, but then he became, in 1772, appointed the court of King George III as a historical painter and surveyor of the king's pictures. Now think about this. A Quaker from Philadelphia who has no professional training travels, does the grand tour, he's studying art on his own. He then becomes the court painter to the king. And then he becomes the second president of the Royal Academy. While he was in London, a lot of Americans from the colonies that then became the United States went to London in order to study with Benjamin West. So he became not only a really important artist in London, but he also became a really important artist in this country because so many people studied with him. So today I'm going to talk about not just the Venus and Cupid. I think it's important for us to understand his career and his contribution. So I'm going to be talking about West's portraits created between 1746 and 1759 while he was an itinerant painter in Philadelphia and New York City. His trip to Italy between 1759 and 63, that was following the academic tradition that I'm going to elaborate upon. The iconography of the Venus and Cupid, West in London creating history paintings of antiquity and of the present in a neoclassical and romantic style, And then I'm going to be talking about a new work of art that's now in the Vanderbilt Fine Arts Gallery. And I think it's now been changed to the Vanderbilt Art Museum, but I'm not 100% sure of that because I retired. But I think I heard something about that. Anyway, they have a preliminary drawing, and I'm going to be talking about that because it's done in, it continues the neoclassical style, and the subject matter is a genre painting that is a scene of everyday life. So let me begin with Benjamin West portraits. I'm going to show you these two portraits of Dr. Samuel Bood and his wife, Mary Bethel Bood, dating from 1755 to 1756. So these portraits are pretty common for the 18th century in the colonies. We don't have any photography, right? So if you want any way to record what somebody looks like in a family, you're gonna commission an artist to do that. Again, in the 18th century, we have no art schools, we have no museums. So artists are really teaching themselves. There is somebody by the name of Galt who wrote a biography of Benjamin West, and he was a friend of Benjamin West, and he claims that Benjamin West knew some Iroquois, and that the Iroquois taught him painting. Whether or not that's true or not, we have no idea. But they wouldn't have been teaching him painting if he did study with them. That would be realistic, for example, in the 18th century. So these are pretty accomplished portraits for the time, and I'm going to be comparing it to a work of art by another artist in the colonies at this time, and you'll see that he's working in a style that actually prevails in the colonies at this time, and it also is the same style that you would find in 18th century Great Britain. Now, how would he know about Great Britain? He would not know about Great Britain because he hasn't been there yet, but there are artists who immigrated here, and he would know them, and he could see reproductions. There would be reproductions in newspapers and things like that, which he would have access to. So these are companion portraits, and they're typical for the time frame, giving you three-quarter portraits of the figures so that they fill out the surface of the canvas, giving you gendered identification of the figures. The woman is in a landscape, and she has a frame of trees on the right to underscore that she is a woman and underscore her relationship to nature and fertility, while her husband is standing also in a regal pose or a stately pose, but he's got this swag of drapery behind that underscores his importance and the idea of dignity. And then you've got the column, besides it being phallic, which of course in the 18th century they wouldn't be thinking about the column as phallic, but it is, it's a symbol really of greatness, of dignity, and you're going to see that in any kinds of portraits you see of this time of statesmen, like Louis XIV. I want to compare West's portrait to this one by John Smibert, and it dates a little bit earlier. Smibert is from Scotland, and he emigrated. He studied in London, and the Royal Academy had not yet been established, but he studied in London with some people who knew about art, and he obviously traveled abroad. And he also went to Italy. He emigrated to the United States in 1728, I should say the colonies at the time, settling in Boston. Now, he traveled to Boston, right? Benjamin West traveled to Boston and New York, so he would have known Smibert, he would have seen Smibert's paintings, and you can see the similarities between the two. So although he doesn't have any professional training, you can see that he's actually pretty accomplished, because the stiffness of the figure and the emphasis on the contours, which we might think is a little, giving you a stillness, well, that's the style of the time. So he's actually working in the style that prevails at this particular period of time. By the way, if anybody has any questions while I'm talking, don't be afraid to raise your hand and ask me. So now I want to talk about West's trip to Italy and the academic tradition. In 1760, he arrived in Rome, and 5 years later, he receives his first commission. The commission is from a couple who are from the United States. Well, it's not the United States at the time, but I'm just gonna, we know that it's not the United States, but I'm gonna use the term the United States, if that's okay with you. So they were from the United States, and they were on the Grand Tour. So it was not unusual for, just like today, we go to Europe in order to see art. So I'm going to Paris in September, and then I'm going to Amsterdam and Turkey, and yay, anyway. So I'm going to be doing my own Grand Tour, which I've been now fortunate to be able to do many times. But in the 18th century, people who had money would, of course, take the boat, because there were no planes, in order to travel to Europe, and they would go to all of these major places. So this couple, I believe from South Carolina, commissioned this work from Benjamin West, and it's called Venus and Cupid, dates from 1765. So I refer to the academic tradition that was established, as I said, in Paris in the 17th century. If you know art history, you might know Nicolas Poussin, and he is the artist who came up with the curriculum for the École des Beaux-Arts. And what I really want to emphasize about the curriculum is about the hierarchy of subject matters. Because according to the academy, and what we refer to as the academic tradition, there was a hierarchy. If you wanted to really become famous and be known, you would create a work of art that's a history painting. And a history painting could be a classical subject matter, like that of mythology, or it could be taken from ancient Roman history, or it could be taken from European history. It could be religious, that is, any biblical subject matter would be considered to be a history painting. We've already talked about mythology. Literary, so Shakespeare, for example, not at this period of time, but later, a little bit later, was a very common subject for artists to paint, both in the United States and abroad, and allegorical subjects. Those are all considered to be history paintings. Next comes genre painting. Genre painting is a scene of everyday life. If you're seeing farmers who are tilling a field, for example, or if you see people who are indoors having a cup of tea, that would be a genre scene. That's number 2. Portraiture would be number 3. Still life, and we all know what a still life is, a representation of inanimate objects, like fruit or flowers or whatever. And then finally, number 5 is landscape. Now you can make money by way of portraiture, right? You can always make money by way of portraiture. But if you're going to be a portrait painter, according to the academic tradition, you're not going to become famous. And at this time, how do you become famous? You become famous because you submit your works either to the École des Beaux-Arts or the Royal Academy for an exhibition. And if you're accepted to show your work in the exhibition, that means, well, you've made it. But if you're going to do a history painting, you're going to be able, your chances of getting into the École des Beaux-Arts or the Royal Academy are much higher than if you're doing any of these other subjects. This is in the 17th and 18th century. It changes a little bit as we move forward, and today this doesn't apply at all, no matter where you are in the world. West, in deciding to create a painting of Venus and Cupid, is creating a history painting. It is from mythology. And I'm going to be talking about that subject matter a little bit more, but before I do, I want to point out that he is very much influenced by Italian Renaissance art. he's living in Italy. He's been to the Uffizi, he's been to the Vatican, he's been to every place you can go in order to see all the works of art from antiquity and the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and he has studied these works. So if you look at his Venus and Cupid in relationship to Titian, for example, you can see that there's a very similar way of painting. They're both not only representing the figures so that they are visible to your eye in a realistic manner with a clear foreground, middle ground, and background. Notice they both have landscapes in the background, but they're even painting in the same kind of painterly technique. The brushstrokes and way that they use, and even the colors are quite similar. He was not only looking at someone like Titian, but he was looking at Correggio, who's a later period of time, and a friend of Benjamin West said that he painted this work, that is Venus and Cupid, when his mind was full of Correggio. And you can see the similarity in terms of style. So it's not only the way in which the bodies are rendered, the realism of the figures, the colors, but if you also look at the contours of the figures and how they connect to all, here you can look at the connection among the figures and how they echo one another. It's the same thing with Venus and her son Cupid. One hand is curved around, his arm is curved around. They're very close together. Even the circular format, which is referred to as a tondo, comes from the Italian Renaissance. You can see works of art, especially by Raphael, that use that circular motif. Anybody have any questions so far? So what I want to do now is to talk about the iconography of this work of art by Benjamin West. And what we mean by iconography is we're not only talking about the subject matter, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit more about Venus and Cupid from mythology, but we're also looking at a work of art within a historical context and what that work of art is telling us about the period in which an artist is living. And so that's what I want to delve into right now. So I'm first going to focus on the mythological subject of Venus and Cupid. I'm going to be talking about Venus in relationship to the Virgin Mary as the epitome of female virtue. I'm going to be talking about the nursing Madonna and female procreation, and finally changing attitudes towards child-raising practices. And you're going to think, whoa, all of that in the Venus and Cupid? And I'm hoping that I convince you that that is indeed the case. So, between 1765 and 1803, Benjamin West created 18 paintings dealing with the subject of Venus and Cupid, various aspects of the story. So that's really interesting. He's not just doing this one painting, it's one of a series, and it's actually the first one of the series that he did. And he's representing different phases of the story of Venus and Cupid. So we all know Venus is the goddess of love, and that her son is Cupid, and that Cupid would hit somebody with an arrow, and that person would fall into love. There's lots of other stories about Cupid and Venus. For example, Cupid was a very mischievous child, and one day he got stung by a bee, and that, believe it or not, is actually a very common subject in art history, especially in the 18th century. West did a number of paintings in which Cupid has been stung by the bee, and here is his mother who's comforting him. We're looking at, in this particular work of art, we're just looking at Venus, who, as his mother, the goddess of love and fertility and beauty, is in giving some instruction to his son. Maybe he's saying, I want you to go hit that person with the arrow. Or maybe she's condemning him for being stung by the bee earlier. So anyway, but what I want to emphasize is you've got an intimate relationship in both of these works between the mother and the child. As I mentioned to you, this is very much influenced by Renaissance art, and you can see the similarity between Raphael, and I earlier showed you a Titian, and Benjamin West. But I now want to go beyond the similarity in style and composition and painting technique, and talk now about the way in which Benjamin West has represented the relationship between Venus and Cupid, which is very similar to the Madonna and Child. In fact, in the history of art, the Madonna is usually clothed in blue and red, as you can see here. Notice here that she's clothed in red. That's not accidental. If you look at the relationship between these two paintings and the closeness and intimacy between the mother and child, he is deliberately evoking, I want to argue, the Madonna and Child. And why is he doing that? Well, I'm quoting here an art historian who's written a fabulous book, not on Benjamin West, but on this period of art. And her comment is not about this particular painting, but it applies to this painting. The consciousness of an identity between the Holy Family on the left and an idealized version of the modern domestic sphere, which I want to suggest to you is represented on the right, results in their appropriation for their wives and their role as mother, the supreme example of female virtue. In other words, what I want to suggest to you is he is deliberately evoking the Madonna and Child theme, a religious theme, and replacing it in the secular context as a model of motherhood. And Benjamin West is not unique to be doing this in his paintings. And I want to go one step further, and I want to say that he, in fact, is looking at the iconography of the nursing Madonna. There is a long tradition of the Madonna who's nursing her son, and I'm showing you just one example. I could be showing you any number of other examples, all of which, this is Northern Renaissance, so it's in Amsterdam, and Benjamin West did not go to Amsterdam. I should have given you an Italian work, but I didn't. I'm thinking of it right now. At any rate, but the relationship between Cupid, who's close to Venus's breast, you have that idea also of the nursing Madonna. It's furthermore underscoring the idea of female virtue, appropriate female behavior and virtue. Now I want to go yet one step further, and I want to talk about attitudes towards child raising, because I want to suggest to you that this painting is also talking about the fact that the way in which you raise a child has changed from the 16th century and earlier to the 17th century. And I'm showing you two works of art in order to illustrate the point. Because this work, which dates from 1671 to 1674, and we don't know the artist's name, we call the artist, him, the Freak Limner, because he painted Mrs. Freak and Baby Mary. But what is the relationship between the mother and child here? Yes? The child looks like a miniature adult. What makes you think of this child as a miniature adult? The clothing. What else? The proportion. What else? The posture. Have you ever seen a baby sit that still? No. So there is somebody who, at this particular period of time, wrote in her diary, a mother who wrote in her diary, she was following the proper practice to raise a child. And in her diary she wrote, I tried to have my daughter, who was 2 years old, sit in a chair nonstop for an hour. And she would not do that. But that was, you believe that a child was born into sin prior to the 17th century, or the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, yes? And so the mother, not only the children really were dressed like adults. They had proper clothing for little girls and proper clothing for little boys. They didn't dress the same way, but they were like adults, and they weren't allowed to play. So if you would ever go to if you ever go to a museum of toys, you're never going to see a toy prior to the 18th century, because children didn't play with toys. They did not exist prior to that time. Yes? Yes, you could definitely suggest that. But if you look at what's written at the time frame, manuals about childbearing practices, etc., what I'm saying is whether you were elite or not elite, that was how you were expected to raise your child. In other words, intimacy was not allowed. Now, you're absolutely right that if you could afford it, you would have a nursemaid and you would have somebody else nursing your child, right? But, and that would bring an intimacy. But at this particular period of time, you were not encouraged to form that intimacy in the process of nursing. Isn't that sad? Anyway, so if we think we've got problems today, imagine the problems these kids had growing up then. So the relationship here is completely different. You've got an intimacy between mother and child. You have a sense of closeness, and everything in the composition is uniting them. There's a circular motif in the framing, but then you've got all these circular motifs within the composition. And as I said, you have echoing of postures, etc. So you've got an intimacy in between the mother and child.
They're actually looking at each other.
And yes, exactly. They're also looking at each other, and here, no, it's completely wooden. But that was the anticipated behavior of a child at this time. So what I'm suggesting to you is that Benjamin West's painting can also be looked at within the context of changing attitudes towards child-rearing practices. Now, West is not unique at this time. I could show you lots of other works of art. In other words, what I'm saying is that he is not unique in doing this. It is what you would find in other paintings at this particular period of time, both in Europe and in the colonies. Any other questions or comments? I loved your comment about the nursing, because you would think, yes, that would create the intimacy, but it was discouraged. So what I want to do now is I want to talk about Benjamin West's accomplishments that made him become the painter to the king, become the second president of the Royal Academy. In other words, if he continued doing Venus and Cupids, and as I said, he did 18 of them, they would get recognition. But that would not be like, oh my God, this artist is like breaking norms and creating something really important and new. Because just like today, we expect artists to create something that's new. Back then, you were expected to get attention by doing something that's in the tradition, but then that is extending that tradition. So I'm going to be talking about Benjamin West and what he did after he was living in Italy. He did Venus and Cupid. He moves to London, and he becomes established there. One of the first paintings that he does when he settles into London is Agrippina with the Ashes of Germanicus. dating from 1768. The subject matter is taken from ancient Roman history. And the story has to do with Germanicus, who had fought in battles, and the emperor felt that Germanicus, by winning so many battles, was threatening his control of the nation. So Germanicus was killed in battle, and the emperor had determined that he could not be buried back in Rome. But his wife, Agrippina, actually went to get his ashes, and she brought his ashes back to Rome, and there was a huge pageant and celebration of Germanicus. So that's the story that Benjamin West has created. So it's also a history painting, not mythology, but taken from ancient Roman history. And what he has done is he's created this work in a neoclassical style, meaning that he is influenced by antiquity. First of all, I want to say that if you look at this painting and you look at this painting, the colors are not too dissimilar. You have more colors here because there are more figures like greens and yellows. The painting technique is not very dissimilar. We're not focusing on just two figures who fill up the surface of the canvas against a landscape, but we are looking at a larger scene in which in the foreground you've got a number of figures who are telling you the story that they're trying to convey. And then in the middle ground, you've got architecture that's letting you know that you're in ancient Rome at this time. And in the background, you're looking at a landscape. Furthermore, we're looking at in the center, Agrippina, who's carrying the ashes surrounded by her children and an entourage who's with her. You've got people who are in mourning, and you've got a group of figures on the left who are framing the central motif, and a group of figures on the right that bring you into the composition. You have a clear foreground, middle ground created by the architecture and background. Now this painting, as I said, is done in the neoclassical style. So John Winkelmann had written a book about the history of ancient Greek art that, in fact, at the time was considered to be really, really significant because nobody had written really a book, and he was an archaeologist, about ancient Greek art. There's a lot in the book that's incorrect because at the time they didn't know the difference between ancient Greek and ancient Roman, and it is hard sometimes to discern the two. But it was published in 1755. And what he wrote in his book is, there is but one way for moderns to become great and perhaps unequaled. I mean, by imitating the ancients. In other words, Winkelmann, an archaeologist who's written this book about ancient Greek art, is encouraging contemporary artists of his time to be influenced by antiquity in order to become a great artist. So I'm showing you on the right a frieze from the Areopagus, which is a very famous work of art in ancient Roman art. But if you look at these figures and how the way in which they're clothed and the relationship between them and the children, and how a frieze is really being on a single line, all of that is manifest in these figures right here. So he's looking literally at ancient Roman art in order to create his composition. He's also looking at architecture in Rome, and he's incorporating it in his architecture that you see in the background. Now, I want to indicate to you that at this particular period of time, artists are just starting to be influenced by antiquity. Now, the Renaissance is a revival of antiquity, and I don't want to talk about the difference between the Renaissance and neoclassicism, but they are different. And so I'm showing you on the top right, Gavin Hamilton is a British artist, The Oath of Brutus, that dates from 1763 to 1764. And this is also a history painting that is dealing with a historical subject matter that's influenced by antiquity, and it is an ancient subject matter. The clothing they're wearing is ancient. You've got the columns. Which painting do you think is more successful?
In terms of academic?
Not in terms, thank you, Wesley, for asking me to be more specific. Which painting, when you look at it, not in terms of the subject matter, but in order to read the meaning of the work and understand the relationship of the figures with each other in the background, which painting do you think is more successful? Pardon me?
The Oath of Brutus.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Action in the Oath of Brutus.
Yes, there's a lot of action in the Oath of Brutus. Yes, and what's the action conveying to you?
That Caesar's getting backstabbed.
Yes, he's conveying the subject, and you're able to understand the subject.
Yes.
Absolutely, and you're able. Well, I had to explain the subject to you here, but you could understand the subject here. But which composition is clearer for you to understand?
The West.
Why?
Because you've got clear mourners. There's no doubt that they're mourning. You've got people watching, and you've
Clear
got,
mourners, people watching.
and the architecture places it for you. The arches and
Right. The architecture places it for you. You have a clear foreground, middle ground, and background. Here, all the figures are compressed into a tight space, and they fill up the whole space, right? Whereas your proportions here are clearer. So my point in this is that he's not the first artist to create a work of art that we would consider to be neoclassical in its style and subject matter, but his work is more successful, and it was recognized as being more successful in London and Great Britain at this particular period of time. I just want to indicate to you that then as you move forward into the 19th century, neoclassicism would be very, very common as a style. So I'm showing you another work by a British artist. If he had just in the Agrippina carrying the ashes of Germanicus, which got rave reviews in London, it was exhibited in the Royal Academy, and it got, it was written about in newspapers at the time. He then created another work of art that further established his fame, and it is this one called The Death of General Wolfe, dating from 1770. Now, in this work, we are not dealing with antiquity. We are dealing with recent colonial history. We're talking about, or he is representing, the Battle of Quebec during the French-Indian War of 1759. When he first submitted this work of art to the Royal Academy, the then president, the first president of the Royal Academy, Joshua Reynolds, said that this was a problematic painting because you could not represent something that was distant, not distant in time. You needed to represent something from the past, not the recent present. But what Benjamin West did was to create a work of art that it's not moving forward right now. There we go. That, as you can see, it's a very similar composition with the group of figures on the left and the group of figures on the right, and you have figures in the middle ground, and then you have, or in the center, and then you have a middle ground, not architecture, but the battle that's taking place, and then you have the landscape in the background. So the composition is not dissimilar, and your ability to read what's happening in the work of art is also not dissimilar. But what he did is, by taking this subject matter from recent history, he appropriated religious iconography to elevate the heroism of General Wolfe. General Wolfe had fought in a battle on behalf of the British against the French, and as you can see, he was wounded in the battle that's taking place in the background. And he was, what you're seeing here is that he's literally dying, but although he has been killed, the British, somebody's coming forward right here to announce that the British has won, they've won the battle. So you're seeing General Wolfe as he's dying. Now everything in the painting is bringing your eye to him. The lighting is bringing your eye to him, the colors are bringing your eye to him, the rifle that you see here, the Iroquois who's looking here, all of the figures are looking at him. Everything is bringing your eye to him. The flags are creating a diagonal that leads you literally to what's happening here. And then you have the stormy clouds, the sun is scoring, the drama that's taking place at this particular period of time of this event. All of that is one of the ways in which this is considered to be a very successful painting. But then the other thing he does, there we go. The other thing he does is, if you look at the pose of the dying General Wolfe, is based on that of the dying Christ, right? The subject of lamentation that you see here, or entombment. I'm showing you Raphael or Albert Dürer, very famous works of art. In fact, it's not accidental that he's got a wound, just like the wound that Christ has, and somebody's holding the cloth against the wound, and his pose is based on that. In other words, what Benjamin West has done is he's taken a recent historical subject and he's elevated its significance, suggesting that Wolfe, as it becomes a secular hero, who he didn't die to save mankind like Christ, but he died in order to save the British in fighting against the French in the French colonial war. And so although Joshua Reynolds thought, I'm not sure about this, this work of art was considered to be very, very, very successful. How many of you have studied Jacques-Louis David? Jacques-Louis David, the 19th century artist. And if you studied him, I'm sure you learned that he's one of the first to create a contemporary history painting. Like if you think of about the death of Marat or images of Napoleon, predated by Benjamin West many, many, many years. So I'm just going to make a little dig about the history of art. I'm sure that when you studied, if you took a survey of art history, you would study David and his contribution to the neoclassical painting and giving you a contemporary event in a neoclassical painting, but it's Benjamin West who did this about 50 years before David. And you would not be studying David. Anybody have any questions? How are we doing for time? So I want to show you, I'm not going to elaborate too much on this, but you may be thinking, why is the Iroquois here? So a couple of things about the Iroquois. Number one, we know that Benjamin West literally had some friends who collected Iroquois paraphernalia, and we know that he studied them. We know that he knew the Iroquois when he lived in Philadelphia. And we know that even the tattoos you see on his body are correct. So the Iroquois actually did have tattoos that you see here. So historically, the Iroquois is the way in which he's represented with this bag that you see here, all of it is actually 100% correct. However, we also know that there was no Iroquois person present at the Battle of Quebec. Although indigenous people were involved in the battle, no indigenous person was present at the battle. So why did Benjamin West include him? That was the subject of an article I wrote in 1995, because every time I taught it, I was like, now why is he here? I'm not going to go into all of it, except to say that the Iroquois is in a pose of meditation, right? And he is looking at and contemplating the death of General Wolfe. Now that pose represents what we refer to as the vanishing American. And when I say we refer to it, I mean we art historians refer to this as the vanishing American. And Benjamin West was one of the first people to represent the pose of an indigenous person who is meditating, and he's meditating upon the death of his race. In other words, the significance of Wolfe's winning the battle is that eventually, because this is already prefiguring manifest destiny, which is not coined until the 19th century, but it's already prefiguring the idea that in order for the British or the French or anybody to take over the new world, the indigenous people need to be extinct. And so I'm just showing you some other works of art that convey the same subject. If you know George Catlin, if you know, whoops, I want to go back. If you know George Catlin, he's somebody who's dealing with the dying race. And I don't know how many of you pay attention to the tympanum on the Senate side of the US Capitol building, but this is it. And I can't go into the entire subject matter, except to say it's Progress of Civilization, 1855 to 1863, in which you're seeing an allegory of America, who is standing in victory. And beside him is a backwoodsman who's cutting down a tree. And next to him is an indigenous boy who's been hunting. And next to him is an Indian chief who is in the pose that you see in Benjamin West's painting of contemplation about the destruction of his race. And in order to make this very clear in the work of art, right here is his mother and child, and in the corner that you can't see here is a grave, suggesting that with the progress of America as a nation, the indigenous people are going to become extinct. So what I'm suggesting to you is that Benjamin West was already conveying that in his painting, The Death of General Wolfe. I'm not going to elaborate about this work because I want to leave time for questions, but I just want to show you one other work of art which was really, really significant. His Penn's Treaty with the Indians, 1770 to 1772. It is an event that occurred in 1682, so it's again a contemporary historical painting. It was commissioned by Thomas Penn, who is William Penn's son, and it was in order to commemorate William Penn's treaty with the Indians that we all know about from our history lessons that go back in time. But you can see that it is again a contemporary subject matter that's represented in this neoclassical style. So I just want to take a minute and point out to you that very recently there's a drawing that was submitted to the Vanderbilt Fine Arts Gallery by Benjamin West. So I love that across the street and here we have two Benjamin Wests in Nashville, Tennessee. This is the drawing. It's very, very small. It's a preliminary drawing, and it's three ladies making music. It dates from 1798. And it is a preliminary drawing, meaning that he's created this work, He's created this work because he's thinking about a painting that he's been commissioned to create. It's three ladies making music that dates from 1798. And in the academic tradition, you were encouraged to do a drawing before you do the final work. So you can see that he's in this, thinking about, the girl with the tambourine. They're located at the piano, the relationship between the figures in this interior setting. It is a genre painting that is a scene of everyday life, which is it belonged to the English tradition from Hogarth, and after the war broke out in revolutionary France in 1793, there was a celebration of English ways that took a patriotic appeal. So the subject matter may be a genre scene, but it is arousing patriotic feelings. And I want to point out to you that he's still working in the neoclassical style, so that, for example, the chair is taken from antiquity, and this is the name of the chair. The figures are wearing some ancient garb, or alluding to some ancient garb, but you are in a contemporary setting, a domestic setting at this particular period of time. And I want to furthermore indicate to you, I'm sorry, I'm going to bypass this. And I want to furthermore indicate to you that at this particular period of time, well, let me see, where do I have it? Let me go back. Back. Uh-oh. Well, anyway, in the idea of creating a genre painting, Benjamin West had written a friend of his earlier and said, I'm never going to do a genre painting because I'm not going to make any money from it. But at this particular period of time, genre paintings then became popular. So he did do this genre painting, which is in the Virginia Museum of Art, and we have the preliminary drawing located at Vanderbilt. So we've got one painting here from the beginning of his career, and we have one drawing there from the end of his career.
Yes. Help me again in
computers.
thanking Dr. Fryd for joining us tonight to talk about Benjamin West.
Thank you very much.
I do want to make note of our next symposium. It will be online October 1st. You can register and attend for free. And I want to emphasize, it will not be recorded as many of our online symposia are. This one is going to be with Dr. Giovanni Veri, a conservation scientist with the Art Institute of Chicago. He actually consulted with us with his groundbreaking research on our exhibit, The Role of a Replica, on the lower level. He will be presenting on recent investigations and the new research into color on ancient statues. I'm hoping that some of you knew that those ancient statues were covered with paint, and they were very colorful compared to the white versions that we currently have. I also hope that you get a chance to view our current exhibit, David Gutnick in Contemporary Kumiko. It will be up through December 1st, and stay tuned for a symposium date with that amazing artist. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you're the first to know about all the exciting things happening at the Nashville Parthenon.